10 p.m., June the 12th, 2020. This is Hannibal from the HannibalTV.com with my weekly Wrestling Observer review, where I go over all the weekly news from Dave Meltzer's Wrestling Observer newsletter that I find interesting. I don't go through all the news. I'll be honest, I don't care much about Japan. I only report on the very relevant stuff about Japan. Mexico, same thing. Pretty much the U.S. news. Hello to Colonel Quayle there, and the notes that I find interesting. And there's a lot of it this week, so I'm going to get into it right away. Yo, back to you, Ethan Wilkins. With the WWE news is what I'm going to start with. Big change this week in WWE Creative, with WWE ratings continuing to decline. There's been a change. Bruce Prichard is now taking over as the head of creative for both Raw and SmackDown. Paul Heyman is no longer going to be in creative, in theory, just being an on-air talent as Brock Lesnar's mouthpiece. Before, he was working under two contracts. In all likelihood, he's just going to be under one contract now, so it's a little bit of a demotion for Heyman. So what's interesting about this is Eric Bischoff and Paul Heyman last July, they were announced as being in charge of creative for Raw and SmackDown, respectively. Neither of them made it a full year before being replaced. Bruce Prichard, who is known as a master politician, slipped in and ended up taking both of their jobs. According to Meltzer, Heyman's creative contract was officially terminated on June the 11th, so yesterday. Raw has been doing record lows in ratings almost on a weekly basis. Fox can't be very happy with SmackDown's ratings either. They were expecting a 1 rating on average, and they've been lucky if they can get half of that lately. And USA can't be happy that Raw's ratings have been in the 0.4s most of the time. Joe Betch just tipped me $10. Thank you, Joe Betch. He says, I got to give New Japan more of a chance. It's more realistic. I'm not saying the wrestling isn't good in New Japan, but the wrestlers, for the most part, are Japanese, and the North American wrestlers, other than Tama Tonga, maybe a couple others, are all little guys. So I just can't get into it for those reasons. I'm not denying that the in-ring New Japan product isn't probably the best style of wrestling out there. I just can't get into it from a language barrier, and I'm just not into it. So thank you for the $10 tip, Joe. Tony Smith also tipped me $5. He says he's glad that I got that cancer spot removed from me and I'm clear of it now. Thanks a lot, Tony. That $5 tip is helpful. I use it all towards shoot interviews, but as I've said on this podcast before, I actually had to pay to get the cancer spot removed because the healthcare system here in Canada is still on lockdown. They don't really care if you have cancer or you need surgery on something or you need a chemotherapy treatment. They only care if you have COVID-19. Daniel Rod Heimer, a friend of mine, he's 42. He was one of the contestants on 2004's Tough Enough, won the Republican nomination for the 3rd District in Nevada for a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. He's calling himself Big Dan Rodheimer now. He was signed to a development contract despite not winning Tough Enough. They liked his look. He had a great look. Stephanie McMahon apparently was very high on him, and they wanted to put him in a group with Randy Orton and Edge as the main heel faction in WWE. but Rod Heimer ultimately quit wrestling. I had heard through various friends in WWE, developmental, and on the main roster at the time, that Randy Orton didn't necessarily like that Rod Heimer was taller than him, more muscular than him, more cut than him, and Orton could have considered Rod Heimer as competition. So there may have been some heat over that. But Rod Heimer had a successful real estate business, and I'm going to actually interview him soon. Meltzer also went on to talk a lot of shit about Rod Heimer in this, which I don't know. I think you should be proud of wrestlers that are doing well in politics. It's a good thing for our industry because it promotes our industry in a positive light. But I guess he didn't like Rod Heimer for whatever reason. Went on to say in the Wrestling Observer that he wasn't a good wrestler and other personal stuff. So I'm not going to get into that. I've wrestled Dan Rod Heimer, and I didn't think he was a bad wrestler at all. Said it yesterday in my news. He's tough. I remember I chopped the hell out of him. He didn't complain. Speaking of my time in Deep South Wrestling, another guy I was friends with in those days was Luke Gallows, who I've been talking to recently about doing a shoot interview. Once his contract, no compete clause runs out mid-July. Meltzer says that Gallows and Carl Anderson are likely going to be looking at a deal that will allow them to wrestle in both the U.S. and Japan once that no-compete contract expires in mid-July. So we'll know more around that time. And as I said, I don't know if the border is going to be open by then, but he'll probably do either a Skype or an in-person interview with me in July. Gallows is doing a new character now called Sex Ferguson as well, for any of you that haven't heard. It's a comedy type character where there's a lot of going around punching people in the balls, and he's working on some big stuff of his own that's he's keeping on the down low right now. Jinder Mahal, another buddy of mine, underwent knee surgery this past week in Birmingham. Originally, it was supposed to be minor surgery, but apparently the damage ended up being more significant. And there was some talk that he was going to feud with Drew McDonald, but that talk was, I guess, thrown out the window now that Mahal is going to be out for a while. WWE officially canceled their Japan tour this summer. They also canceled their July NXT UK tapings. And according to Dave Meltzer, that brand will likely be on hold until around October. They haven't done any tapings there since March. Arn Anderson said this past week that in regards to Sami Zayn, saying he could possibly be an agent when he retires, Arn disagrees that Sami would be a good agent. He says that he's too headstrong. Anderson personally clashed with him when he was in WWE, and he doesn't think Zayn is creative enough or patient enough to be an agent. There's been talk in recent weeks that Evolve, it's unsure if that Evolve company that had a relationship with WWE is still going, or if they've closed down and sold all their tapes to WWE. Always a shitty company, anything I've seen of Evolve. Total Bellas has apparently been renewed for a 6th season. Total Bellas, I don't even know if NXT ever beat Total Bellas in the ratings. They're consistently beating NXT in the ratings. I've never seen the show personally, but congratulations to them for being picked up again. The NXT TakeOver show last weekend, from all reports, was considered weak. There was some banter back and forth on Twitter between Randy Orton and Tommaso Ciampa, who I guess is an NXT wrestler, over the good old boom, stupid leg slapping. that's very, very prevalent in pretty much almost all the matches, if not all the matches in NXT and AEW. I don't know, I've done kickboxing training, I've done MMA training. When I was a kid, I was in Taekwondo for 3 years. Whenever I threw a kick, I was never told to slap my leg, never told that. Always keep your hands up, try and keep them above your cheeks. Protect yourself. Don't lower your hands, slap your leg when you throw a kick. The cat's out of the bag. Back when Shawn Michaels and Chris Adams did that in the 80s and 90s, it was before the internet and before wrestlers in almost every match did the leg slapping. It's like the stomp punching. Remember those stupid stomp punches? People make fun of wrestlers for doing that, just like they do for the stupid leg slapping. The cat's out of the bag. Stop doing it. It sucks. Let's get into the ratings now. You know, every time I hear about AEW ratings, I can't stop thinking about how close Rick Moranis and Tony Khan look like each other. I'm sure all you remember Rick Moranis from Ghostbusters and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. But with Tony Khan, all I can think is like Honey, I Shrunk the ratings, because these AEW ratings are shrinking and shrinking. This past week, the numbers were disappointing. Once again, AEW only did a 0.23, with NXT only doing a 0.16, which Total Bellas beat. Total Bellas did a 0.17. WWE Backstage on June the 9th did a 0.03. They're bringing in Bret Hart to WWE Backstage next week. You know, I keep hearing about all these Bret Hart supporters whining and bitching about how Bret Hart, his career, his wrestling career got screwed over by the Montreal Screwjob. Okay, he went on to make $2.5 million a year in WCW. He went on to wrestle Vince McMahon in WrestleMania, be a general manager of SmackDown, beat The Miz for the U.S. title, be in the WWE Hall of Fame, get DVDs released. He did a WWE Network thing with Austin this year. Now he's being brought on Backstage. He's consistently worked for WWE. I think the only point in time he didn't work for WWE was when he worked for WCW, and maybe a short time after. He's been continuously making money. So please explain to me how this guy's poor career got screwed when he's making money still to this day from WWE. That is a load of bullshit. Raw this past week did a 0.53 rating. SmackDown last week did a 0.5 rating, which they've been getting a lot lately. Not much in the way of AEW interesting news. Chris Jericho continued. It's like Chris Jericho is just collecting a paycheck. The main heel group in AEW is Chris Jericho's comedy troupe of heels. They're just a group of goofy heels, and we can see by the dwindling ratings, nobody cares about their shitty comedy wrestling. And then Chris Jericho's podcast, he just goes on, and I can't even listen to it unless it's like a music. I've seen a couple of the music episodes, but like he did a recent episode breaking down how they put together the Stadium Stampede match, talking about him and Mike Tyson out of character. It's like we watch a magic performance, then the magician does a podcast explaining how he did all the tricks. Then he still wants us to watch his next magic performance the next week. It might take a while, but every week fewer and fewer and fewer people are going to care about the magic tricks because he's just going to explain it the next week. So good for you, Jericho. You're collecting your money, but you really don't give a fuck about the business anymore. But I'm happy that you're paying wrestlers. You're donating to Brian Knobb's GoFundMe. You've donated to numerous GoFundMes, but you're obviously just collecting a paycheck. You're financially set. Good for you, but you're not helping AEW's business by continuously breaking kayfabe. Not that Tony Khan doesn't. I mean, he's the biggest. There's no longevity to AEW, in my opinion. No longevity at all. Howard, speaking of how nobody cares about AEW, Howard Stern, I guess, on June the 8th, talked about Gold Dust on his show because, Howard Stern talks about controversial characters. The subject of Gold Dust came up. Somebody asked what he's doing now, and one of his co-hosts or whatever replied, he's working for some backyard federation. So, I mean, the mainstream people don't know or care what the hell AEW is. In Japanese wrestling news, New Japan returns on June the 15th. They're going to have 5 empty arena shows, and then their first shows with fans are going to be July 11th and 12th. Those shows are only going to be set up for around 4,000 fans, which is 33% of the arena's capacity. Technically, WWE, AEW, and really anyone they want could be back to running shows in front of fans in Florida, by the way, if they wanted. It's unknown when WWE is going to start doing this, but you can imagine with how brutal it is to watch wrestling with no fans, or even the development contracted wrestlers and NXT stars in the crowd. Like, it sucks. So you'd think they'd really want to get on to letting fans back into the arenas. In other wrestling news, Mr. Wrestling 2, Johnny Walker, died June the 9th at 85 years old. He was one of the biggest legends in the history of Georgia wrestling, particularly from 1973 to 84. Everyone in Georgia knew who he was. His wife, Olivia Walker, who he cheated on, according to Tony Atlas, was the premier robe maker in pro wrestling. She did robes for Flair, Tommy Rich, Dusty Rhodes, Paul Orndorff, Greg Valentine, even Dolly Parton. I'll take a break as someone tipped me $4.99. I'll always take a break for one of my generous tippers, such as Stray Bullet. He says he's a big fan. WWE this month has been celebrating Nexus. Do I think Mason Ryan deserved a push? He had the look. I was actually friends with Mason Ryan when we wrestled in the UK together for All-Star Wrestling. Since we were both big, we often wrestled together. And actually, he was also signed from the WWE tryout in 2009 that I was signed from, coincidentally. And I won't tell the story. Actually, I'm not even going to tell this funny story I have about Mason Ryan. But I did actually create his first online dating account for him. So do I think Mason Ryan deserved a push? I don't know how he was in WWE, but I can tell you from wrestling with him in the UK, unlike Dan Rod Heimer, I mean, Mason Ryan was tough. He could take chops. He could take a beating. He was very stiff in the ring, hard to move around. He also had a very thick Welsh accent. I don't know how he talked in his WWE run, but when I knew him, if you've ever been to Wales, they talk with very thick accents. So I think depending on how he was able to make his accent more understandable for Americans, that may have affected his push. But he is a nice guy. I haven't actually, the last time I saw him was at that tryout camp that we both got signed from. And one thing I remember from that tryout camp was the very first day, Mason Ryan was sitting at the tryout camp with Ty Bailey. So they already had like an agent sitting with him, and Ryan said that Bailey was driving him around earlier that week. I guess he had flown to Florida a couple days before, so it seemed like he was a guy that they already loved his look. So as I said, the only reasons I would think of why they didn't continue using him could have been with his wrestling may not have improved or his accent may not have improved. But does he have a great look? Yes. And thanks again for the $4.99 tip, straight bullet. Dominic Dinucci, who I've done an interview with, you can look it up on this channel. He's 88 years old. He had a heart issue this week and was rushed to the hospital on June the 5th after experiencing some health problems, including fatigue. He was diagnosed with stenosis of the aorta. The doctors performed a routine catheterization to insert a stent into his now narrowed artery, and the surgery was performed on June the 8th and was considered a success. He's resting now. Dinucci's last match was in 2012. At the age of 81, he teamed with Shane Douglas, who I think I have 2 shooter interviews with on this channel now. And of course, Dinucci trained Shane Douglas and Mick Foley. New Zealand has had no COVID-19 cases and have lifted their restrictions. So wrestling in New Zealand can go back with full crowds now. I don't know anything about New Zealand pro wrestling other than the Bushwhackers are there, but back when I trained, or from there rather, but when I trained in amateur wrestling at TriStar, they had a wrestling program in Montreal for amateur wrestling under, I think he's 5-time Olympian Doug Yeats was one of my coaches there. But I had a friend there that was a successful amateur wrestler from New Zealand. So shout out to him. Pete Gas, for anyone that remembers him from the Attitude Era, underwent a partial hip replacement on June the 5th. I do not know when the last time Pete Gas wrestled. He was, in real life, good friends with Shane McMahon. In MMA news, as we've reported a lot on this channel, Conor McGregor announced another retirement last week after UFC 250, trying to steal the thunder a little bit from UFC 250. He's been having issues with the UFC related to pay and fights. He's not the only one. John Jones also has, George Masvidal has, and Henry Cejudo has. These are other guys that are not accepting fights or are retiring, saying they're retired anyways because they're not getting the pay they want or the fights that they want. The way that UFC business works now, they have a lot of guaranteed money. So whether the big stars fight or not is not a huge issue for them. At the same time, nobody believes McGregor's retirement is real, especially since he's retired a few times in the past. He'll likely be back. The Atlantic, who once did a story about my feud with Abdullah the Butcher, did a story on UFC Fighter Pay recently and talked about the cost of being a fighter as far as coaching goes. And apparently, on average, American fighters pay out approximately 32% of their purses for coaching and other reasons. That cost goes up for international fighters. They pay on average 40% for coaching and other things. So everyone that always asks me, why did I never do MMA? It wasn't as popular when I was younger. The money was not there. And also, you make way more as a wrestler because you can wrestle way more often. As a fighter, maximum you can fight 3 times a year. Plus, you have to pay out all these costs for licensing, coaches, and so forth, training. But of course, I would still fight if the right offer came. If someone wants to make me the right offer, I would still fight. I'm in great fighting shape right now, too, by the way. I've lost weight and muscle mass due to the gyms still being closed here in Ontario as of June 12th. But I've been doing tons of body weight training and lots of fight training. So I'm in great fighting shape. UFC has officially announced that Fight Island is going to be on Yas Island in Abu Dhabi next month. It's not going to be like what everyone thought. Yas Island is actually an island in Abu Dhabi that's like a destination island for tourism. They've got car racing there, other stuff. There has been past UFC events on Yas Island, so it's not like they've bought a deserted island and are going to have a cage on a beach and the island's just going to be for UFC fighters. This is a deal that UFC has come to for 4 shows to be recorded there next month. There's not going to be fans in attendance. And basically, yeah, it's just going to be a Yas Island thing. There's going to be 4 shows on July 11th, 15th, 18th, and 25th. It was originally came up with to book foreign fighters that can't get into the U.S. However, by July, travel restrictions for people that want to come to the U.S. might be lifted. So it might not even be necessary. And yeah, it's a popular leisure island in Abu Dhabi, not a deserted island. I'll take a break to answer a few questions of people that have given me tips. Carlos Gambino, someone I've got a tip from before, tipped me £5. He says he's watched a lot of my channel lately and some of my wrestling matches, and he wants to say it's a shame I never got my run in the WWE. Well, thank you for the nice comment and the £5 tip, Carlos Gambino. We all know the story. I had a contract. Unfortunately, Abdullah the Butcher gave me Hep C purposely. I won 2 lawsuits over it. He never paid me back. Luckily, I managed to get cured. Cost me a fortune to get cured. Never got another shot at wrestling, but I am doing this now, and this seems to be my forte. So because of tips like this, I can continue on getting interviews. I did New Jack this week. I'm doing Sonny, the original Sonny from Glow this week. Next week, Jimmy Corderas from the WWE. He was in the ring for the Owen Hart fall, as well as the Daniel Puder, Kurt Angle incident, Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels WrestleMania match. But he's not going to be my only interview next week. I'm working on a few big ones. So all these tips help. Stray Bullet tipped me $4.99. He says, hey, man, do I believe Muhammad Hassan could have been top heel? It was rumored he was going to beat Taker for the strap. I suggest everyone search up Muhammad Hassan, the Hannibal TV. I did an interview with him on this channel. He ended up being a high school principal where you get benefit, difference in kids' lives. It's a stable job. You don't have to travel all over the world. He's still alive, unlike a lot of wrestlers that die young. So maybe ultimately, just like I got fucking screwed over at my chance in WWE, maybe it's a good thing that he got too much heat and got his run screwed over. Could he have been a top heel? I'll have to admit, I was not watching wrestling much back then. I stopped watching it regularly around the year 2000, and then would only periodically watch it. I have no recollection of what he was like in the ring, but obviously he had heat. So who knows? Anything's possible. I did meet him at various extra jobs I had in those days, and I remember he was nice and polite to me, even when he was getting that monster push. So good guy. And then he was also good to me after. He lives in Syracuse, New York. I've tried to get a career interview with him numerous times, but I guess because of his teaching job, he doesn't want too much details about his life out there just yet. He keeps telling me he'll contact me when he's ready. So hopefully I'll get that one day. Maria Davis just tipped me $2, by the way. Thank you, Maria. Back to the UFC news. For UFC 250, the 4-hour preliminary show on ESPN had 775,000 viewers. So UFC, a lot of people, I've mentioned this before, but a lot of people think that UFC gets great TV ratings. Overall, they don't do great TV ratings, but for the big fights on pay-per-view, there's a lot of interest. People are interested in the name fights on pay-per-view. So as far as ratings, they might be beating AEW and NXT, but Raw and SmackDown generally beats UFC in television ratings. Of course, Amanda Nunes retained her women's featherweight championship with a dominant decision victory over Canadian Felicia Spencer at UFC 250. So sorry about the loss there for Felicia. Nunes was paid $500,000 for winning that fight. Sean O'Malley had a KO victory over Eddie Winland in the bantamweight division. I saw that KO. It was a pretty good KO. O'Malley got $130,000 for that win. Winland got $46,000 for the loss. So think about that. This guy, Eddie Winland, fought in the UFC, got $46,000 for losing, and then he had to pay over 30% to his coaching and training and so forth. So think about that for a moment, for getting your brains beat in and getting a concussion. I mean, if you get knocked out like that, you're losing brain cells. And he only got 50 or 46,000 before he had to pay his coaches and everything. Jermaine Sterling beat Corey Sandhagen with an impressive chokeout victory at 128 in the first round. Jermaine got 202,000 for the win. Corey got 80,000 for the loss. Cody Garbrandt beat Rafael Asensio with another knockout, another bantamweight fight. There was 3 bantamweight fights. Second round knockout. Cody got 310,000 for winning. Rafael got 79,000 for losing. And Felicia Spencer, I forgot to mention, by the way, got 125,000 for getting beat up for 5 rounds by Amanda Nunes. So poor Felicia. Alexander Gustafsson is coming out of retirement, moving up to heavyweight to fight Fabricio Werdum on July 25th from Abu Dhabi. Stipe Miocic is fighting Daniel Cormier with the heavyweight title on the line August the 15th in what many expect to be Cormier's retirement match. Khabib's father is opening up his eyes. He was in a coma, I believe. He's recovering a little bit after heart surgery. And in boxing news, it's being reported by Tyson Fury himself. He's teasing this, that the heavyweight title fight between him and Anthony Joshua is still close to being made. But there is some financial issues, as Deontay Wilder is supposed to get a rematch before Fury fights someone else. So by not giving Deontay a rematch, they're going to have to pay Deontay out. Apparently, Daniel Kinahan, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right, he's the leader in putting the Fury versus Anthony Joshua fight together. And according to Meltzer, this Daniel Kinahan, or whatever his name is part of one of the largest Irish organized crime groups in history. And he's putting this fight together in order to try and whitewash his image. I'll get into some of your questions now. We're already over half an hour, so I'm not going to do too much of this. Colonel Quayle says, Paul Heyman bombed out. C4P says, Bruce Prichard, head of creative in WWE. He was head of creative, or he was a big force in creative back in the late 80s. So 30 years later, he's back as one of the head forces of creative. So we'll see if he can work the same magic. I think they really need to replace Triple H as head of creative for NXT. as NXT is doing absolutely horrible now. I know he's the boss's son-in-law, but he's more. Here's what I remember about NXT TakeOver. Okay, here's what the main picture that came out of NXT TakeOver. It's Shawn Michaels typing on a computer in gorilla position with Triple H and the Road Dogg looking over his shoulders. So they're more concerned about getting over that DX is writing NXT right now than getting over anything on NXT. And they're doing a horrible job writing NXT. There's Adam Page. He looks like a ninth grader, and I won't get into it again, but he looks like not only a ninth grader, but a ninth grader that doesn't work out. Malafay says wrestling is more than just in-ring work. C4P has a good point. Heyman has a wife and kids now. He's not the ECW creative genius he once was. He's just a company guy. He doesn't care. Jody Smith says, congratulations on getting rid of the skin cancer. Thank you. Someone's asking, who do I like better, Bobby Lashley or Drew McDonald? Bobby Lashley. Not even close. Double S says he's part of the Death Dealer's army. And yes, I am the Death Dealer. I was known as the Death Dealer since 2014. Billy Graham gave me that name. The Jericho's buddy there in AEW, I guess, is now calling himself the Death Dealer, trying to rip me off. I'm not even going to say the guy's name, but it's a clear ripoff of me. And in a shoot fight, that guy wouldn't last 5 seconds with me. Kentucky Fried says, what a great achievement by Dan Rod Heimer. I agree. Bera 7331, did I get along with New Jack in the interview? Yes. I mean, I've met him before. He was very polite to me before. It was an interesting interview from the standpoint that he was very subdued in the interview. He went through all the questions I had, which I didn't expect. I thought he was going to give more detailed answers, but I guess like for whatever reason, he's more subdued these days and he was more to the point. I do believe he was a lot more honest in my interview with him overall than some of the other interviews where he gets into it more. I believe it's a very honest interview and whatever, he answered all my questions. So I hope you guys like it. There's 4 clips posted, and the full interview is posted now at patreon.com/thehannibaltv. He talks about all of his incidents in the interview and some other stuff that he hasn't covered before. So patreon.com/thehannibaltv. You can watch all of our full shoot interviews first and ad free. And above that, it's only $1.99 a month, and you're helping support me and the work that I do. Someone says they're going to watch that tonight. Victor Murphy says the New Jack clips are great. Anthony Shabbat, don't understand what he's saying. Jake Piskin, never understood why Jinder Mahal wasn't over. Thought he was a great heel champ. Well, he was the champion, so you can't. He was WWE champion. I think he was the 50th WWE champion, so you can't take that away from him. One thing I noticed from my own time wrestling Jinder Mahal, who I've wrestled multiple times and beat every time I wrestled him, by the way, is he doesn't like the hard-hitting wrestling. I remember you chop him, you do a forearm to him, you hit him with a chair. He doesn't necessarily like that. Bera7331 just tipped me $5. So thank you, Bera7331, for the $5 tip. Motor Stash says he thinks even the wrestlers in NXT UK don't watch NXT UK. That is hilarious. I agree. It's horrible. What's worse than NXT UK? The Everlasting Peep Show. Do I think Undertaker will ever wrestle Sting? And if not, is it because Seth Rollins injured Sting? No, it's always about money and creative. Cash and creative, as Jim Ross likes to say. I had to stop listening to Jim Ross's podcast because of all the advertising on it. It started to get really boring. But they're running out of stuff that'll draw. So, yes, The Undertaker versus Sting will happen probably just because they're running out of stuff that'll draw, and none of the new guys are drawing. So they're going to have to resort to that. So there's probably more of a chance of it happening than it not happening. PWC 24/7 just tipped me five or $4.99. Thank you, PWC 24/7. Thoughts on Cornette disliking the cement segment that Austin did? I listened to some of Cornette's stuff, not all of it. Never heard that one, so I can't comment on it. Sorry about that. Interesting thing that New Jack said on my interview with him is that Jim Cornette called the security guard and the N-word back when they were in Smoky Mountain Wrestling together. It seems like a lot of the old school guys before like in the last 25, 30 years ago used to use that word more commonly. And I'm glad it's not being used as much anymore. Did I watch Joe Rogan's podcast with Ronnie Coleman? Only some clips of it. And the clip where Ronnie Coleman said he didn't take that much steroids, I don't know if I believe that. All the surgeries he's had over the years from bodybuilding, I don't know if I believe that he says he didn't take that much more steroids than the average person. No doubt he had great genetics, but I don't buy that he didn't take much more steroids than the average person. Big Brother Thunder, do I believe Wednesday Night War ratings will continue to decline? Yes, I do. Double S says, honey, I shrunk the wrestlers in relation to Tony Khan looking like Rick Moranis. Well, AEW does have about 5% of larger wrestlers now. I will give them that. But overall, it's a whole roster of little guys that do gymnastics. And yeah, between watching men's gymnastics or listening to a UFO lecture in 2020, Hannibal would rather listen to a UFO lecture any day than watching the comedy troupe of wrestlers in AEW do gymnastics and leg slapping. And speaking of that, someone just says guys just blatantly do the leg slapping now. Motor Stash says even Chris Jericho now seems like he's reaching when defending AEW. Jericho's making more money than he ever has in AEW, working once a week, maybe sometimes twice a week. He's making a fortune, and he's the biggest star in AEW by far. So, of course, he's going to defend it. They're paying him huge money. If AEW paid me the money they're paying Jericho, would I defend it? Probably. Because it's a price you got to pay for making all that money. Speaking of which, someone brought up, do I think Kenny Omega should be pushed as the top star rather than Chris Jericho? Definitely not. Chris Jericho is by far the most household name of anyone in AEW. And I believe Jericho is the main reason they're beating NXT 30 times. NXT's only beat them 5 times. AEW's beat NXT 30 times in the ratings, and there's been one draw. So should Jericho be the star of AEW? Yes, because unless you're an absolute smart mark, you don't know who Kenny Omega is. He's not a mainstream star. He was never in WWE. Even Jon Moxley is a way bigger star than Omega. Then you take into account the controversy stuff of Omega. Like, he's a controversial wrestler. Let's put it that way. And I'll be honest, can he do some great technical stuff? I guess. But he does such fake stuff that I'm just not interested. I don't think I've ever sat through a Kenny Omega match. I've watched a few seconds of it, and I got bored. He's boring to me. John Resident says AJ Styles won the Intercontinental Championship tonight. What are my thoughts on that? He's a better champion than Sami Zayn. Sami Zayn sucks. I agree with Arn Anderson on that. Ivan Santos says a lot of these AEW wrestlers look like high school kids. I agree. Big Richard says Sunday Night Heat used to get better ratings than the modern day Raw and SmackDown ratings. I believe it. I haven't looked that up myself, but I believe it for sure. Alan Kesselman says AEW is awful. I'll answer only a few more questions. A lot of repetitive questions on here. DBag0584 says, I turned off SmackDown when New Day kneeled and raised their fists. I'm watching for wrestling, not racism. And I'm a supporter of anti-racism stuff. Definitely I am. But one thing, and I'm not just seeing it, I'm not just talking about this as incident, or not incident. If they want to make their stand on SmackDown, no problem. It's not a first. But WWE does like breast cancer awareness segments now. I guess somebody said homo on their Twitter when they were 19. They're now 27 and they got kicked out of AEW. There's so much politically correct stuff in wrestling. The reason wrestling used to be good was because it wasn't politically correct. And like you watched it to escape politics. So just that wrestling is now so politically correct is one of the things that makes wrestling so boring, because it's not supposed to be politically correct. It's supposed to be an escape. But do I have anything against their opinion on that and their anti-racism stance? No, I do not. But I do agree wrestling should be wrestling, but they're not wrestling. They're entertainment. A couple more questions, and I'm going to close this off. There's a lot of questions on here. I really appreciate everyone's tips. Big Richard says, remember when Iron Sheik was a heel in the middle of the Iranian hostage crisis? They should bring something like that back now. They couldn't. They couldn't. And Raka says he totally agrees with the political stuff infesting wrestling. So we'll end it at that. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the Hannibal TV. If you want to hear the full shoot interviews, I do ad-free audio version and get the instant downloads. Subscribe to the Great North Wrestling Podcast on iTunes. Go to thehannibaltv.com for the direct link, or look in the description of this video and you'll find the direct link as well. So have a great night, everyone. Appreciate all the tips and comments.